Attorney Stephen Flatow, thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure.
Before we start, I first want to congratulate you on your recent aliyah to Israel. Mazal tov.
Well, thank you. The nicest thing people have said to me in the past year is welcome home. And it's true. I feel at home. Although I will tell you that my wife and I made aliyah the day before the first lockdown.
Wow.
So it has not been a lot of fun. I will tell you that. But we're here, we feel at home, and we're looking forward to many more happy days here in Jerusalem and in Israel.
Amen. So I want to start first with your story. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that over the past 25 years, you have been at the forefront of the legal efforts to combat the state-sponsored terrorism by Iran. There's even a U.S. amendment named after you, the Flatow Amendment. Now, for those who aren't familiar with your incredible story, could you tell us where it all began?
Well, it actually begins in 1979. When Elisa, as a 4-year-old, insisted that she was not going to public school. And she was going to a Jewish school. And we wound up sending Elisa to a modern Orthodox yeshiva in New Jersey. And from there, she fell in love with the state of Israel. Also brought her family along religiously in a very nice and smooth and calm way. Elisa took 6 trips to Israel before she was murdered in 1995. I'd only been there twice by the time of her death, and we encouraged Elisa and indeed her siblings to come to Israel, because when they came back, they not only came back to the States as better Jews, they came back as better people. Her final trip, which began in January 1995, and which was to end with her murder in April, was the one she'd been working on while she was a student at Brandeis University. She took 3 years of courses in 2.5. And she was able to take a leave of absence to come to study at Nishmat here in Jerusalem. Unlike many American high school graduates, yeshiva graduates, who attend gap year programs, she wanted to study on her own. But I think her real purpose of doing that was to be able to sneak off to the Kotel whenever she wanted to, sit in the sun whenever she wanted to, go to the beach whenever she wanted to do, and to do Israeli things. It was on that trip that she discovered that chickens actually had bones, that they had legs and they had necks, and she'd only thought chickens came in cutlets. Being an American, being an American girl, she would shop at the shuk regularly, and her Hebrew was getting better with each passing week. But more importantly, her level of studies was phenomenal. We came across her notebooks just a few years ago, and I showed them to Rabbanit Henkin, the dean of Nishmat, and she says she couldn't believe the level that these girls were studying back in 1995. She says it was astounding. She was looking at the notes and the neat handwriting and pointing to Meforshim and being her own Meforesh, if that's the right Hebrew phrase for a woman, and coming to an understanding. Elisa wanted to take a few days off in the sun before Pesach of that year. So she and 2 other American girls embarked on a trip to Gush Katif, which was then in Israeli control. And as the public bus she was taken approached the gates to Kfar Darom, a van sitting alongside the road jumped out that the bus exploded when it hit its side. It was carrying a bomb designed by Islamic Jihad and Hamas. Elisa and 7 others were murdered in that attack. We brought Elisa home after donating her organs here in Israel because the need was great. And I started speaking out about the roles of America and Israel and American Jewry towards Israel. And then I got a phone call a year later saying that the United States had just passed a law with a very long title called the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act of 1996. And one of its provisions gave American citizens the rights to sue state sponsors of terrorism for acts against family. And we heard from the State Department that Iran was the #1 state sponsor of terrorism, and they were the funder. They supplied financial aid to Islamic Jihad, which actually carried out the attack. So I retained an attorney, Stephen Perlis, in Washington, D.C. We began looking at the law. And we found out that the law had all these holes in it. The backstory to the law was that President Clinton wanted it badly, but the State Department didn't want it at all. So they left out a lot of legalese from the statute. And in that summer of 1996, the other Steve and myself, we started working on getting the law amended. I would travel to Washington, D.C. at least once a week, sometimes twice a week, to meet with congressmen, meet with their staffers. And I learned that the one place you don't want to be in the summer is Washington, D.C. It's muggy, it's sticky. You walk out of the train station in the morning, you just feel the moisture on your face. And by the time I would get back on the train at 7 o'clock at night to head home to New Jersey, I was exhausted. But we got the law changed. A year later, somebody called it the Flatow Amendment. Now, when you look at it, it says paragraph 3 shall say may, and paragraph 14 shall, and things like that. But a court, for ease of reference, called it the Flatow Amendment. And we filed our lawsuit against Iran. And 8 or 9 months later, we got a judgment of $247 million for its role as the financial sponsor and aider and abettor of Islamic Jihad.
Wow.
And that's when the fun really began, because Iran never appeared in court against us. We thought they would, and we were looking forward to the opportunity to showing the world Iran's evil underside, and it is evil. How they plan and they plot for the deaths of others using surrogates to act in their behalf. Today we know Hamas and Hezbollah, Islamic Jihad, are still getting money from Iran. There are other terror groups in Yemen that are getting money from Iran to basically take over the region. When it comes to Israel, they just want to kill Jews. That's their goal. And 26 years later, we're still slugging it out with Iran, this time in some courts in Europe. And we're still trying to hold their feet to the fire. Unfortunately, as in America, where politics raised its ugly head, same thing happens in Europe. Lower courts rule in our favor. The appeal courts say no, 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 no. And it's still an ongoing struggle. What we did actually is we created what people now call lawfare against state governments, and the elected governments, if that's the right word, the bureaucrats do not like it. So it's something that we bear with some pride, and at the same time we shake our heads how difficult governments have made it for victims to pursue the killers of their family, children, parents, things like that.
So from what I understand, was it President Clinton himself actually, you've met with him several times, he actually urged you or provided you some sort of information in order to sue Iran, but then when it came to act, once the judge ruled in your favor, in terms of collecting the money, then it was, I'm sorry, we can't help you, you cannot, and because Iran did have assets at the time in America, or maybe they still do, not financial assets, but was it banks and buildings and embassy buildings?
You summed it up beautifully. The State Department was giving us information, but when it came time to collect, they blocked us. They refused to carry out our writs. Now, yes, there's physical real estate in the United States. We located property in New York City, an office building. They had an interest in an office building. And when we went to attach it, the federal government stepped in and said, no, 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 it's not Iranian, it's independently owned, there's nothing to do with the Iranian government. And then about 7 or 8 years ago, the federal government seized the building, saying that it was Iranian controlled. That was the kind of frustrating experiences that we dealt with. But there was also money in this country. We had located $400 million in an account called the Foreign Military Sales Act account that the Shah of Iran had deposited with the United States in the late 1970s. That money was used as a down payment to buy American armaments, things like that. When the Shah was overthrown, that money de facto became the money of the government of Iran. We dug it out. State Department, Treasury never told us about that account. But
how did you find these things?
Somebody dropped a dime to our attorneys, which is a phrase maybe Israelis don't understand, but it means they called and said, hey, look, they're hiding this account from you. Now, it was $400 million in 1979. What we could never find out is how much interest accumulated on that money. So that $400 million was used to eventually compensate our family and other victims of Iranian terrorism. And the law that provided for that was gave the United States a lien on that money that was going to be used to reimburse the Treasury for making the payments out. Before he left office, President Obama signed the so-called nuclear agreement. And before he left office, he also sent back over $1 billion of money to the Iranians. In that bundle of literally cash was the $400 million that had been earmarked to reimburse the American Treasury. So the money that we had targeted actually was never used for that purpose. It was sent, to our embarrassment, back to Iran and has been used to fund terror in the Middle East. And it looks like we're heading in that same direction again. Of course, there's more money's been blocked, more money's been put under sanctions, and now we're on the verge, it looks like, of releasing the financial sanctions as well.
Mm-hmm. What was the reasoning that you received from the State Department why you couldn't collect?
Oh, they had a beautiful phrase. Iranian assets were sacrosanct. They were holy of some sort. They were kadosh. Mm-hmm. And during a meeting, someone said to me, look, we can't let you seize Iranian assets. What if they seize American assets?
They did.
and my answer was, yeah, but that's what started this whole thing in the first place. You've got to take a stand. You know, you can't let them continue to control the situation. And look, it's hard to express this to someone working in the State Department, but they don't realize they're in the shook. Mm-hmm. That the price Iran wants has to be negotiated. But the Iranians are holding back. So the America should be holding back as well. I never opposed, and I've said this in print and in audio and on video, I never opposed America having a relationship with Iran. They just have to do certain things. They have to recognize that they've been a state sponsor of terrorism. They have to publicly get out of the state sponsorship of terrorism, and they have to compensate the victims of their terror over the last going on 40 some odd years. They just can't escape that. Instead, President Clinton lifted restrictions on the importation of pistachio nuts, carpets, and caviar into the United States. That's a nice small gesture. The Iranians didn't even reciprocate by a centimeter. Nothing. And the same thing happened with the nuclear deal. They supposedly did A, B, and C, and we now know years later they didn't do A, B, and C. That they're rushing headlong into purifying uranium. The science of that I really don't completely understand, although I know that the phrase centrifuge was used back when America was developing the A-bomb in the 1940s. So whatever these centrifuges are, they're essential to the purification of uranium to make it fissionable, to make it something that can explode. They haven't been honest about closing down their reactors. I think that's now clear. Even the International Atomic Energy Commission recognizes that the Iranians have been talking out of both sides of their mouth at the same time. And now we have the Biden administration heading headlong into so-called indirect negotiations over this, and they seem to be getting nowhere. But they're willing to give and to give and to give without Iran reciprocating in one small part.
Why do you think that is?
People know better than us, supposedly. And when I say us, the average guy on the street. In effect, as the old saying goes, if it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it's a duck. The Iranian mullahs and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard, they're killers. And the Biden administration and the European Union countries, they refuse to see it. They refuse to acknowledge it, at least publicly. They may say behind closed doors, but their behavior has been atrocious. When we were trying to seize our assets and money was being blocked, there were countries in the European Union who were openly trading with Iran, and it was difficult for the United States to lay on their sanctions because Italy couldn't get fuel. France had a problem, similar problem. Germany we could never understand. And the European Union, as amorphous that it is, really undercut American sanctions until Trump became president, when he raised the level of sanctions to even European companies. Some of them were afraid to deal with Iran.
You mentioned now President Trump. I'm just curious, did you have any talks with the Trump administration about collecting the money?
We tried. We felt we had, I hate to use the phrase, rabbi on the inside. For your non-American listeners and viewers, rabbi means somebody who can connect you. It's commonly used in politics. Whether a Jew or non-Jew, they call them the rabbi. We thought we had someone on the inside, but they couldn't understand what we were trying to accomplish, and it never went any further. I was personally disappointed. I was very disappointed that they didn't see that we were trying not just to help ourselves, we were trying to help America and other victims of terrorism to get these guys out of the business.
And have there been others, since you guys set the precedent that you could sue Iran and you won your lawsuit, have there been other cases of people filing lawsuits?
Dozens.
And have they been successful?
They've been successful at the lower court. In other words, they've obtained judgments as I have. They have not been successful at enforcing their judgments either, and not just against Iran. The Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO, has been brought into court numerous times, and the courts, because of politics, have found a way to knock out the judgments. Other people have sued foreign banks who had a role in passing money through. Those cases are much more nebulous. It's much more difficult to track that fund. But some people have been successful. Whether they've collected or not, I do not know, because if there's been negotiations on settlement, they're usually sealed and nobody says a word beyond that. But we started the ball rolling, and even to this day, I assure you that if somebody can come up with a terror event involving an American victim of Iranian-sponsored terrorism, there'll be a lawsuit filed. I mean, our case, lawyers like to copy. We create what they call templates, and our case was the template for them all, even down to the form of judgment. But we had a 2-day trial. We still had to demonstrate to the court the fact that Iran was behind Elisa's murder and what her life was like, and we projected what her earnings might have been like had she lived to get married and have a career. So it wasn't just a cakewalk. It required a lot of preparation, and like I said, 2 days sitting in court, which were not the most pleasant. But we did it, and that's what other people have gone through also.
I understood that you found concretely that Iran, they weren't hiding it. They were funding the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. They had it in black and white, one of their reports.
One of our experts, Patrick Clausen, who's in Washington, D.C., reads the Iranian newspapers. And he reads Iranian documents. He's fluent in Farsi. And he sees a budget with a line item for Islamic Jihad. Once that came out, believe me, they took it out of there, and they call it something like Palestinian nationalization, something nebulous like that. But when you list a payee in a budget, I mean, it was like the smoking gun. What was more difficult was showing the transfer of money to Islamic Jihad. But my attorneys were very good. The information we obtained, though, was under seal, so people can't see actually how it made its way from Tehran through Europe, through the Middle East, back to Europe, through the Middle East again, into the hands of Islamic Jihad and Hamas. We didn't know at the time that Hamas actually had built the bomb. We had found that out afterwards. But we weren't inclined to litigate with either Hamas or Islamic Jihad because they're organizations, but not in the real sense of the word. We left it up to Israel to do that, and they did. October 1995, Fatih Shikaki, who was then head of Islamic Jihad, was killed as he stepped out of a hotel in either Cyprus or Malta. Yahya Yash, the so-called engineer, had his head blown off by using a cell phone the following year. And we have to assume that Israel was responsible for that. In the latter case, Hamas reacted very destructively. There were a series of bus bombings in Jerusalem in early 1996 in revenge. So obviously, Israel touched the nerve. He was the fellow, but we believe he worked with others in Islamic Jihad and Hamas to get the bomb to this stupid kid in Gaza to drive the van and murder 8 people.
You brought up already the Biden administration and the renewal of talks with Iran. As someone who lived in America, in New Jersey, correct?
Yes,
for mostly your whole life and a recent Israeli citizen, how do you think the American Jewry view this? I know there's increasing all these organizations, these J Streets, New Israel Fund, if not now. Do you think that really represents the American community and the American Jewish community? And if so, what do you think their take on it?
Well, let me start back with a meeting I had with Biden back in 2002, 2003. I was invited to a luncheon at $1,000 a head. Okay? But I went to the luncheon. Biden was a senator, influential senator in the United States, and very pro-Israel, as we've been told over and over by him. And he started talking about Ariel Sharon and how the Israelis have to give land for peace. And he was sharp that day because when I raised my hand to ask a question, he says, "I know about your story. I lost family also when they were younger." And I said, "Senator," I said, but what Israel has shown is that it's a right-wing government that makes concessions. Look at what Begin did with Sadat. Look what Netanyahu did by giving back parts of Hebron. You expect Sharon just to sit on his hands? No, I think you're wrong." And then he started talking. He started talking. And to this day, I think he's still talking. He never answered the question or anything like that. But we know from the record that he had a screaming match with Begin in the United States Senate. We know from the record that it's only if you do as I say will I agree with you. I think that was clear when he came here when he was vice president. So I don't think he really has a space in the heart for Israel. I wrote to him after Sharon pulled all the Jews out of Gaza. I said, "Look what they've just done. What do you say to that?" Never a response. I think that a fellow who really felt it in his heart for Israel would have responded to say that, "I remember your question and you were 100% correct." So today we have a section of American Jewry that has continued to bite into this land for peace system. Fortunately, they're not very well supported, but they are supported. Their use of social media and being able to get the attention of news media and sources has been phenomenal. There are many synagogues in America where, believe it or not, J Street has a presence because they speak in such liberal American terms. Isn't it unfair that the Palestinians are deprived of a homeland, without mentioning they were offered a homeland 3 times and they turned it down and said they waged war. The BDS movement is perhaps the most troubling because it catches young Americans who attend colleges, catches them off guard entirely. And unfortunately, a lot of that is due to my generations, the so-called baby boomers generations, not supporting Jewish education for as many Jewish kids in America as we can. I had a after-school Hebrew education. I was lucky in that we used to go to synagogue, my family would go to synagogue on Friday nights, and my wife always lit Shabbos candles and things like that. We were all very proud of what Israel did in the '67 war. We were shocked in '73 how the country had been caught unprepared and resounded and responded with such heroism and guts. But it was the religious education and the love for Zionism that Elisa brought home to the house that made us realize is that we have a bigger role to play. Without Israel, there'd be no American Jewry, in my personal belief. Yeah, we have a large Orthodox and we have Hasidic sects in the New York City, area and other places. But conservative and Reform Judaism, despite what they tell you about their synagogues and the membership, is dying on the vine. They're simply not attracting young adults. And when they do attract a young adult, it's for the purpose of giving their kids bar mitzvah lessons. And we're therefore going to lose that whole segment of American Jewry to intermarriage, or simply just not identifying as being Jewish. Maybe in a Bagels and Lox way, they will. But not spiritually, not emotionally, and not tied to Israel. That's why I greeted with such hope Birthright Israel Taglit. What a phenomenal job it is doing. I mean, I hear reports all the time about young men and women coming back from Israel and how in awe they are of the country. Now, some aren't happy because they've been on religious sponsored trips and the separation of the sexes, things like that. But in essence, they see things that their parents never saw. The parents will never see because they won't come here. And they've seen what Israelis have done on a little piece of land. Now, I'll be honest. I made a shiva call yesterday to the Morris family up at Shalvim. And for some reason, I've never been through that part of the country. And I saw wheat fields and vineyards. And it was just gorgeous. I had just never been through there. And as I said to my wife when I got back, I said, "You've got to see this. Now I understand why people live on Kibbutz Shalvim. It's the country. It's farmland." I was just bubbling. I was foaming at the mouth. I couldn't figure enough superlatives for us. And unfortunately, American Jewry, when they come here on an organized tour, whether it's through a federation type tour or hospital, supporters on the bus, off the bus, let's go here on Shabbat, that kind of craziness. People don't stop to smell the roses that is Israel. And I have to tell you a true story. After we made Aliyah, we were sitting in our apartment on the Merpeset a Shabbos afternoon. And in Jerusalem, people may not understand this, but in June it can be 85 degrees at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and it's hot. And I was sitting there just trying to relax. My wife says, "Do you hear that?" I said, "Hear what?" She says, "The silence." And maybe for the first time in my life, I wanted to reach out and touch what Shabbat was in Jerusalem, the holy city. And here I am, 72 years of age, and I'm still able to feel these experiences. Now, what I don't like experiencing at 72 years of age in Jerusalem, but I'm beginning to take it. I was on the bus today, and a young man got up to give me a seat. And I started laughing to myself. All right, I got a head of white hair, but I really look that old. But I was grateful that he gave it to me because, frankly, riding on an Israeli bus, even coming down Emek Rephaim to Pierre Koenig, where your beautiful office is located, it's a chavayah, it's an experience, it's something to see. And it was so quintessentially Israel that when I explained it to people, somebody got up to give you a seat? I went, yeah. And I got news for you. If there was somebody older who came on the bus with a cane or a package, I would have given them the seat too. And it's just being here at home that is that even an old guy, as my son likes to call me, can feel it and sense it. A number of years ago, somebody said to me, it was actually Rabbi Chana Henkin said to me, "You want to see prophecy come true, you have to come to Jerusalem." She says, "Take a look what Zechariah says." And I looked it up, and it says, "I'll bring you back, and the old people will sit on their canes, and the kids will play in the streets of Jerusalem." And how fortunate are we to see that in our day and age. And on Yom Ha'atzmaut, we were standing on the Merpeset watching the fighter planes go overhead. And you could clearly see the star, the Mogen David, on the tails and on the wings. And who would have thought 75 years ago that there'd be Jews piloting jet planes looking to defend a Jewish homeland? And I'm personally grateful to the people over the years who dropped, as my mother did and my grandmother did, dimes and nickels into the J&F pushka on the counter. To do what in Israel they had no real idea. It was to plant trees, everyone thought. No, it was to build a country. And that's the tool I was alluding to before, that when people are given the opportunity to build something, we still have the capability of building. And that's one of the saddest things about our opposition. They're more interested in tearing down than building up. Mm-hmm. And as I've read more about the Zionist history of Israel, look, it wasn't so we know that Ben-Gurion and Begin were at each other's throats. Well, Begin not so much at Ben-Gurion's throat, but Ben-Gurion at Begin's throat. And there were other people who wrote about the beauty of the land and how to build a country. And while they were doing this, they were building institutions of government. They were building shadow, let's call them health ministries. Let's call it a shadow transportation society ministry. Let's call it let's call the Haganah and Palmach what they were. They were an army. They were a defense force. And even to this day, it's the Israel Defense Force. It's not just the Israeli army. It's a defense force. And when statehood, the opportunity of statehood came, they were ready to go, by and large. There still were some things to work out, and we're still working out things. But this is Israel. And I wouldn't be here if I didn't believe in it and believe in the future. And the future has me concerned.
How do you view the general Israeli-Palestinian conflict? Do you think the Palestinian Authority is a partner for peace?
No, I do not. And unfortunately, they're not doing the job of educating their children. We have two granddaughters here in Israel, 9 and 7 right now. And when the oldest was about 3 or 4, She was with her mother at a medical clinic, and she was playing with an Arab girl. And it was related to me. The Arab mother pulled the child away. We don't play with Jews. And the inconsistency of it all is I wouldn't walk through an Arab neighborhood, Jabal Macabre, I wouldn't walk through Sir Buhur. I wouldn't do that. But yet they're so comfortable walking through Yerushalayim, whether it's Mamilla, whether it's Amon HaNetziv, whether it's Emek Rephaim. They're so comfortable because they know that we're not coming after them with knives and sticks and bats and bricks. So my son tells me, Dad, there are most of these Arabs just want to make a living like I do. So how do you reach their leadership, number one? Number two, where are their voices? Where are their voices? And that's what we do not see. We do not hear it. In the news last week, I know this has become dated now because we're videoing, but there was an Arab leader in Hebron who was complaining about the way the Palestinian Authority was selecting lists for their elections, and he had his house shot at. So where is their leadership? There are people trying to stand up, but they're afraid, and they're not just afraid to have rock stars, they're afraid for their lives. So right now, until the Palestinians start educating their children that Israel's here to exist, that we can get along with Jews, we're not going to have a partner.
It's funny because you mentioned the reality of Palestinian Arabs speaking out. They're afraid. So you would think that organizations, whether it be NGOs, civil society organizations, they would take advantage and they would be the ones to speak out for them. But instead, it seems like a lot of them, or most of them, are there. All they want to do is slander Israel. They want to attack Israel, but they're not even talking about the other side. You think that if all these NGOs that hate on Israel would direct some of their energy towards actually educating about what's going on in the Palestinian Authority and advocating for the rights, we would be in a better position today? Well,
I like to say in marketing, sex sells. The sex out there is attack Israel. Mm-hmm. There's no sex in let's get along with the Israelis. So the people who support these NGOs, they'd rather have people go after the state of Israel than help the Palestinians lift themselves up. Westerners view Palestinians as children. They're not responsible for what they do. They're not capable of doing anything on themselves. Edward Said, who was a virulent anti-Zionist, and I don't think he was anti-Semitic, but he was certainly an anti-Zionist, no friend of Israel, he said it's this aspect of Orientalism that we have to throw off before we can stand up on our own. And I don't know where those people are. I just don't know where they are. Look, what's going on right now in Jerusalem and Sheikh Jarrah and in Salon again, people don't want to know that Jews owned this land before 47. Jews owned this land, whether Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood or whether it was Salon. And when the war came, the Jordanians physically picked them up and tossed them out of their own homes. Now that the courts are enforcing those rights again, it's, ooh, you know, look what these horrible Jews are doing to our Arab neighborhoods. You know, if you haven't paid rent, where's your legal claim to anything? But I'm also troubled about the fact that there are Israelis who see the Arabs as the enemy with no hope of reform. So I don't know how to, counter that. Frankly, I think every time that a Jew picks up a rock and throws it at an Arab, it's a chilul Hashem, that we're not responding in the right way. I'm not saying get slapped on one side and turn on the other, but we have a government, we have a police force that are there for us when we need them. We have to give them the opportunity to do that.
I completely agree. And on that subject, what do you think Israel can do? If you would pick maybe one or two things, how could Israel better combat terrorism, whether it be educating on the ground or increasing deterrence? What do you what would your advice be if you could go ahead now and talk to whoever the prime minister, the defense minister, and tell them this is what you guys should do? What would you think?
Okay, so I'm going to answer your question differently than what you're looking for. My humble opinion, as an Oleh Chadash, the Israeli electoral system does not provide a means of strong government. This concept of lists and having seats in the Knesset based upon the number of votes the lists get, to me, has to be tossed. As far as Steve Flatow is concerned, there is nobody in the Knesset representing me as a resident of, in my case, the German colony. And there's nobody in the Knesset representing somebody who sits in the eastern portion of Jerusalem or any other portion of the country. So when we have ministers, we have people who are put in there as payback. They're not professional. Their hearts may be in the right place, but we have to then depend on and I hate to use the word bureaucrat, with a small b, the people who actually run these ministries. And they're not getting good guidance. They're simply not getting good guidance. And you need a strong political appointee to do that. Now, America has a very similar problem. We have in America the issue of the weebies, which was created, the phrase was created by Aristotle, who was a writer in the United States. He says, whenever a government takes over, whether it's here in Israel or in the United Kingdom and the United States, you have an entrenched administrative population, the bureaucracy. And they're saying to the guy who comes in at the top, whether it's a Yuli Edelstein at health or somebody else at defense or the attorney, justice, we be here before you came, we be here after you came. So therefore, help us do our job. And instead, we get political conflicts within ministries. I don't understand how a Ministry of Justice cannot be in charge of the state's Attorney General's office. As an American, this is totally alien to me. At the same time, how do you put basically an inexperienced politician in charge of a ministry? And it's across the board. They may have great charisma. They may be smart. But the fact of the matter is, they're in that ministry because their party list had a certain number of seats that they have to fill, and there's some crazy agreement that says, well, I'll give you guys 8 seats, and I'll give you 4 seats, and you get 2 seats at the table. And I remember back in the 1990s, when I would read, Israeli newspapers in English more frequently than I do now sometimes, how the great attractor was to give somebody a car with a driver. In those days, it was Chevrolets. I don't know what they're doing. I don't know what they're doing today. So I think it's just a system that is out of place, out of time, and has to be it has to be revised and revamped. Now, going back to your original question, what would I say, Minister of Defense? You got to read Jabotinsky. You've got to show the other side that we're not going anywhere. And you don't have to do it by beating up people. You have to show them by a presence. When my family and I would go to Hebron to tour, we always bring thank you cards for the Chaylim. My grandkids or their classmates make up cards, and they say in elementary Hebrew, Todah Rabbah, and they write in English, thank you for being there. I don't think that the government treats the Chayalim with the proper respect and kavod that they deserve. I don't know how their training goes. I know my son did his 6 months in the Army. When he became a citizen at the age of 25, he was called an old man, right? But sometimes I wonder where the heart is. And then again, I hear stories. I think Israel is so fortunate to have this concept of lone soldiers, kids who are willing to come from the diaspora to be here. And I heard something a few years ago. I was at a dinner with New Jersey politicians, and the organizer of the dinner not only invited me, but he invited 3 or 4 lone soldiers to come. Actually, some of them had made Aliyah by that point already, but they're still considered a lone soldier because their parents are in Britain or in America, wherever they are. And one of the politicians said to one of the boys, what does it feel like being in the Israeli army? And his answer, at 19 years of age, blew me away. He said, look, he said, I know there were American soldiers in Afghanistan and in Iraq, but they're there because their leadership said, you got to be there, and here's our mission. And in Israel, we know what our mission is. We want to have, our mission is protect our backyards. And to hear that concept coming out of a 19-year-old who's put off going to college, even in America or here, it just blew me away. And I don't think that the government recognizes what these kids are doing. And I'm not sure they give them the kind of emotional and physical support that they should have. You know, frankly, when I first toured of the Friends of the IDF, I was astounded. You mean you're buying wool caps in America to send to Chayalim in Israel? I mean, this is, to me, that was unheard of. You know, I understood wool caps being knitted by the Hadassah ladies so they could bring them to the, you know, the neonatal unit at Hadassah Hospital. That I can understand. But you're buying woolen socks and you're buying clothing for soldiers? You mean the government doesn't give them? And he goes, yeah, they don't. They don't. And I think we're seeing, you know, the effects of what happens post-military service, that horrible incident where the disabled the disabled soldier tried to burn himself alive because he's not getting the kind of support. And that's part of the, you know, that's, to me, that's part of the Israeli psyche also, is we don't need anybody to help us. We're tough. And at the same time, I took lessons from Israeli parents after Elisa was murdered. You know, you lose a child under whatever circumstances. In my case, terror, it could be IDF casualty. And it comes a morning that you don't want to get up out of bed. You just want to pull the covers over your head. And the way Elisa died made me realize that, look, 6,000 miles away, there are Israeli parents dealing with the same issue, whether it's terror or whether it was armed combat. And what did they do? They got out of bed and they got dressed. They sat Shiva. They got up from Shiva and they started stepping forward, building and rebuilding a country to not make sense out of what happened, because we never make sense out of what happened to your child. But this is home and we're going to build and we're not going to stop building. And I took chizuk from that more than 25 years ago, and I still think about that morning, and I refuse to let what happened to Elisa turn me sour on Israel, turn me sour on faith, turn me sour on humanity. Things have to be corrected, there's no doubt about it. But we can build. We still have the ability to build.
Well, Attorney Stephen Flatow, thank you so much for coming in. It was really a privilege speaking with you.
And thank you, Eitan, for what Imtir2 does, for speaking up for the people of Israel. And you should go from strength to strength and even have a louder voice in the days and weeks and months and years ahead.
Thank you.